Hi, and welcome to the Oracle Apex Meetup, April 2022. I hope you're all safe and well. A little bit about myself. My name's Alex Turnbull. I work for Apex Evangelist. I'm a senior developer there. I've worked there for 7 years, and we mainly concentrate on healthcare and pharmaceutical work. Previous to that, I used to work at a company called Capita, who specialise in outsourcing. This evening we've got Steve Muench from Oracle, and he's going to be giving us a talk on returning to my low-code roots, tips from his first 6 months on the Apex dev team. That's going to be for about an hour long. If you do have any questions on the presentation, do feel free to put them in the question and answers section within Zoom, and we'll try and go through them as and when Steve would like. If you would like to present at these meetups, please let us know. We'll welcome anybody, and all levels of presentations are welcome. So whether you're a beginner or a seasoned pro, then just let us know and we can work something out. Or maybe you've got something that you would just like to demo or show, whatever, just give myself or one of the alternative hosts on Meetup a shout and we can work something out for you. Future meetups, obviously we're climate changing all the time. Just keep an eye out on Twitter and meetup.com. So without further ado, I will hand you over to Steve. The floor's yours.
Okay, great. Let me know if you can see my screen.
Yeah, we're all good.
Okay, so thanks for inviting me to present. I will talk a little bit about how I got into the Apex development team over the last 6 months, and then present a little bit about the sort of how Apex is used at Oracle, and then talk a lot about the tips that I've found in the first 6 months of working on the team. I saw on the meetup that it seemed like at least maybe some of the organizers were based in Yorkshire, and it made me remember a nice trip I took there in 2014 when my younger daughter was looking for universities, and we spent a nice week driving around looking at Leeds and other cities around Yorkshire and following the David Hockney Trail. I wanted to start by saying thank you to all the customers, Apex users and customers who filled out the Gartner survey. We won with the highest rating of all low-code platforms again in 2022 due to the community's votes. This is sort of like winning the User's Choice Award for low-code platforms, so we appreciate your support on that. So let me tell you a little bit about what I've done over the last 32 years at Oracle and how I got to the Apex team. So in the early 80s, I was fascinated with databases, and both as a teen and early college student, worked with a lot of different kinds of database programs on the Apple II computer, early IBM PCs, early Macintoshes, and then paid my way through university at UC Berkeley, working with a tool called Informix 4GL, building some database applications for small companies in San Francisco. And while I was at university, some advertisements in magazines like Computer World caught my attention from a young company, Oracle, that had a very brash style of advertisements that showed their fighter jets shooting the competitors out of the sky, and sort of interested me to consider whether maybe being a math teacher, which was my original goal in going to university to teach math at high school, instead maybe working for something related to my hobby of programming computers might be more interesting. So I started looking into Oracle as a company, and in 1990 started with what I consider the original gangster Oracle Application Builder, the SQL Forms 3.0, which was beta at the time. The team that I was on in my original training class, we ended up winning the so-called database derby during our 3-week training course at the time. And at that point, I had fallen in love with the Forms environment, how easy it was to build applications, and spent a lot of time over the last 32 years working in Oracle App Dev tools. So you might have stumbled on some of my work related to Oracle Forms, perhaps Oracle XML. I wrote a book on that back around 2000. And I've worked on products like SQL Forms, both as a support engineer and a product manager. For a few years, I worked on a research project called Project Sedona, which was an object-oriented development environment that ended up getting recycled and rewritten in Java to become what's now known as Application Development Framework, or ADF. Wrote an Oracle Magazine column for about 5 years about the ADF product, and then worked since 2010, worked on the technology that's part of Fusion Applications for doing app customization in your browser for something like HCM or the CRM applications. And starting in 2021, last October, I joined the Apex team. And the way that I started getting interested in Apex was I noticed during the lockdown, when I had some extra time, the press was talking about applications that Oracle was building to help the US government with the COVID response, and applications were built with Apex. And the articles mentioned how this Apex was the hidden star that was a low-code app framework that finally hit the spotlight after 20 years. And Larry Ellison was directly involved in the development of these COVID applications, along with many of my now colleagues on the Apex team who were running a hurry-up offense to quickly build some of these apps to track COVID results, COVID vaccination requests, and vaccination supplies. And so I employed the Apex technology for rebuilding an application for a nonprofit that I help with here in Italy, where I live, and a nonprofit that helps children in Mali, in Africa, by pairing donors, Italian donors, with children that may not otherwise be able to go to elementary school. And in one weekend, keeping the same data model, I was able to rebuild my application in a way that the users really enjoyed things like the cards regions and much faster performance. And so it was pretty amazing that I could accomplish that in such little time. And I started to really feel that some of that low-code productivity was coming back and reminding me of the joy that I felt using SQL Forms back in the 90s. And so built myself a personal productivity app to keep track of art that I collect. And at that point, I decided to dive even deeper and attend virtual conferences about Apex and listen to every episode of the Apex talk show, so I could meet some of the personalities behind the product. And it was really impressive to me that the community was gigantic and very enthusiastic and knew the developers by name, mentioning names like Patrick and Karsten and Joel and other people that, and Mike, who's now my boss, were all people getting interviewed and going to these conferences, and it was really inspiring. So I decided to follow that path of joy towards returning to my roots of low-code development tools that Forms had initially started, and joined the Apex team back in October. So I wanted to give you, before going into the tips, a little bit of a peek for how Apex is used inside of Oracle. And so I'll show a couple of quick examples of applications that every Oracle employee is using on a daily basis. One that's got over 1 million hits a day is an application that employees use to look up other employees, find their hierarchies of who they report to, reserve meeting rooms, and a number of other basic operations that people need to do many times a day. Another super popular app used across the company is a Apex app called Einstein that is an internal discussion forum application. And you can see some of the categories with thousands and thousands of posts. Even the teams that do Fusion applications ask and answer all their questions internally using this application. And it will hopefully soon become also the technology used by the external discussion forums that today use a third-party technology that we think will give a much nicer experience for our customers to also be on the same Einstein platform. Internally, Apex is run as a app development as a service that's basically free for any Oracle employee to use. In a few minutes can get a workspace and start building applications. And we've got internally over almost 35,000 apps running on this one server, apex.oraclecorp.com. I'm sure not every single one is a production application, but there's probably at least 6,000 or 7,000 production apps used by many different people across the company. And interestingly, the developers building those applications are not just coders. They're often managers or individual contributors of many different skill levels. And so we're kind of putting our money where our mouth is with citizen development, letting a broad range of internal employees be creating the apps that they need, maybe just for themselves, maybe for their team, or possibly for things that are managing aspects of things that cross the whole company. Different job codes from obviously software engineering, but many other things like product management, consulting, pre-sales are all making heavy use of Apex internally for building themselves productivity applications. And it's not just limited to English-speaking parts of Oracle, it's all across the world, people making nice use of the platform. And the apex.oraclecorp.com internal site is only one of many servers that are running Apex internally. And interestingly, we've been surveying what kinds of code people are writing when they're building their Apex apps. And we have these thousands and thousands of apps to study internally. And we're seeing that, as we had hoped, the declarative SQL language, where you're saying what data you want to query, but not exactly how the database is needing to find it. And PL SQL, its companion procedural language, are the lion's share of the type of code that Apex applications use. And then a little bit of JavaScript and CSS are things that naturally for more complicated types of apps are necessary. But the bulk of the code of the application is still something that is quite straightforward for anyone familiar with the database. And the big new entry in this category is that SaaS applications built by our industry solutions teams in 8 different major areas, ranging from food and beverage and hospitality to construction and finance, healthcare, health sciences, retail, and utilities. Those are all being built internally with Apex. Many of these began their life as an acquisition, so the original apps were written in whatever technology the original company adopted. But once they became part of Oracle, they've begun re-implementing either new features or in some cases re-implementing parts of existing applications using Apex with a core team that's establishing the best practices internally. And many of the people that are running that core team were formerly working on the Apex group, had gone out of Oracle to do external consulting related to Apex, and now came back to Oracle during the COVID application building, and now are using that expertise to really make sure that the thousands of internal Apex developers building these SaaS applications are doing things in the best way. And due to this new focus on Apex as a core technology for low code and trusting that for our this industry solutions for SaaS applications, we've been growing the Apex team that has almost doubled in the last several years to about 70 people and continues to grow. So that gives us more resources to be adding features. If you've looked at all at the 22.1 release, you'll see that it had a nice chunk of brand new functionality in it. And that was largely possible due to the many new developers we've added to the team. And some of the team is also working on new curriculum that I'll briefly mention before we get into the tips. So an entire new free course for Oracle University is something that we've been working on. A number of people have been recording videos, writing lessons, building hands-on labs, and that will be delivered in the form of a couple of different new certifications, a foundations certificate and a more higher level specialist certificate. So keep your eye out in the next few months for that free training that will be based on the latest version that just is becoming available soon, the 22.1 release that's already available if you want to try it out on the apex.oracle.com website. And last, before we get into the tips, I wanted to highlight a couple of new hands-on labs that have been released in the last few months. One is a movies watch list application that helps you see how Apex and REST services can make use of data in a very easy way, even blending data from REST and your local database together in the same app. And then creating a shopping cart application is another fairly new tutorial that's also been released in the last few months that also will teach you quite a bit about using Apex if you're new to the technology. So let's take a look at some of the things that over the last 6 months have jumped out at me as being some of the most useful things that either have saved me time or have been interesting to the kinds of apps I've been building. I've been focusing on both building personal applications as well as creating a number of sample applications that one of which has already been released with the 22.1 Apex, and then others will come out in the future when the time is right. So one really obvious tip that I've seen over many Zoom conferences in the last 2 years that we've been mostly meeting virtually is that when people are working with Apex, often I see them first click on the save button in the builder and then click on the run button. And often you could just save a click by clicking the run button because it also first saves and then runs. And in many cases, unless you're working on a modal page, which can't be run directly, you might save a click by just clicking on the run button and it will save your work and run the page. Another thing that's important to understand about the builder is that if you're ever making changes, say changing a bunch of fields to be hidden, or making a format mask on all of your date fields in a page, you can shift or control select a number of fields in the left-hand component palette, and then the property palette will show only the common properties that that multi-selection has. If you further want to filter the property palette, you can type in the search bar at the top, like say CSS, like in the screenshot I'm showing here, and then you'll only see the properties that match that word so that you can really filter down and only focus on the properties you want to be setting on those multiple items all at once. You can even click on the pin if you're going to be for a while working on checking out, say, the format mask of many different kind of fields. If you pin that search filter, then the palette will stay reduced to show only the matching properties for the whole duration of your editing session until you unpin it, and then it will go back to the normal mode. So be familiar with the productivity features of the page designer, and you can be making often bulk changes to many items and finding the properties you're looking for much quicker by filtering the property name. In the first few weeks I was working on the team, I accidentally logged into the wrong environment, and I saw all these applications that were in Apex. And what I realized was that they were the Apex product built out of Apex in Apex applications. So when you're running the builder, you're really running one of a number of Apex apps that the team has built. And so the product is built with itself. And that is a very interesting capability because while you're looking at the builder at runtime, it means that you can use some features like the interactive report, for example, offers the ability to change the sort and save your own personal reports. You might not think while you're running the builder that you're looking at the output of a report. So maybe you didn't think to do this, but I found myself wanting to sometimes switch between seeing my applications sorted in the most recently modified order or seeing them alphabetically. There might be other interesting orders you could have that would make sense for you, but I defined these couple of options. And so let me just quickly show what that would look like in the Apex builder. Here I'm running on apex.oracle.com, and we'll see that I have these reports here. I've saved an alphabetical and a most recent. So if I sort by most recent, I'll see those. Or if I sort by alphabetical, I'll see the sorted that way. I could then, maybe there's things that might not make sense, like the graphs or something, or maybe there's a clever way of using graphs to see something interesting about your collection of applications. But it's interesting to kind of open your mind to what is possible by the fact that Apex is built in itself. So that's one interesting observation that has made it easier for me to organize the apps in the builder. So the next tip has to do with the code editor that Apex uses in the web-based builder, and that's the same code editor that's part of VS Code. And its project name originally was called Monaco, and it's the JavaScript, sophisticated JavaScript editor that Apex also uses. And so there's a key combination that allows you to bring up what's called the VS Code or Monaco command palette. And it contains hundreds of interesting commands that you can, I've found the most useful ones for doing transforming things to lowercase and uppercase in the text that I'm editing. But you can study virtually any of the commands that are available in the Visual Studio Editor are also available anywhere you're editing code in your Apex builder. Control-Shift-P on a Windows machine, Command-Shift-P on a Mac gets you this little command palette at the top. And then as you start to type, it'll filter the list of commands and you can then quickly pick. It'll also show you the key combination if there's one mapped, so that you wouldn't have to necessarily do it by bringing up the command palette. You could type Control-Alt-L in this example to transform text to lowercase. Another super interesting feature of the Monaco editor is this idea of having multiple cursors. Very often you're doing operations on multiple places in a file that might be a bunch of different PL/SQL parameters that you might want to adjust in a similar way. It might be renaming something quickly, like the P_job text that I have highlighted in my screenshot. So using a few different combinations, Control-Shift-L lets you highlight all the text that's got the similar word that you first clicked on, and then you can erase it or add to it, and all of the text in all of the instances of that are changed at once. So you can, instead of clicking around and doing 5 or 6 or 10 or 100 changes, you can do 100 changes at once throughout your file in a few keystrokes. So this URL, bit.ly.multi-cursor, is a short link to a whole page of the VS Code documentation that explains all the different ways that multiple cursors can be used, and they all work also in the Apex environment. Another interesting thing I was doing while building sample applications was I learned after I had already built an application that my table names needed to be different than what I had chosen. They needed some prefix to be added, and I didn't know about that first. So I renamed all my tables and found this feature in the Apex Advisor. That's one of the application utilities you can run. It's got many, many options it can check and audit, but the one that's interesting to this use case is checking for all the invalid PL/SQL or SQL code. So if you rename tables, of course, that will invalidate any places where you've queried or referenced the table names in your application. And so this nice feature automatically produces a kind of a checklist, a to-do list of all the places in your app that now are illegal, or that have, illegal SQL or PL/SQL because of the wrong names. And then you can one by one click on the view button in each of the entries and it will open the builder on the page where you can correct those mistakes or refactor, if you will, and then just made very quick work of that table name refactoring. So something useful to be aware of. Another feature that was a little bit hidden, often if you're building applications with foreign keys, you know that having the foreign keys indexed can make your application queries in the joins that you do be more performant. And so Apex has a nice built-in report on the object reports page under utilities. Just click unindexed foreign keys and it will bring you to a page that shows all of the indexes that you're missing on your foreign keys. And by clicking this create script button, it will literally create you the script to run to create all the missing indexes in a couple of clicks. So that's a useful audit and time saver that I found many of the foreign keys I'd created in one of the demos I'm working on could be made a lot faster by using this feature. You may be familiar with a capability that are called HTML expression directives. It's a feature that you might have used in the Apex card region to get fancier type of layouts with conditional formatting, where if a certain field has a value, display it one way or otherwise display some other text or some other value, or more of a case statement based on the value of the job. For example, you might format a salary with a commission, otherwise just a salary. These types of conditional formatting also now in the 22.1 release work in email templates. So that means instead of having an email template that just has some placeholders in it, you can now actually have the content of your email be conditionally defined based on the values of those placeholders. So that can mean more customized emails, more effective emails, and or maybe fancier or different formatting for different types of recipients of your emails based on the placeholder values that you're passing into the email template. So if you want to try that out, you can already experiment with this feature on apex.oracle.com because it's part of the new 22.1 feature. I'll highlight a few interesting capabilities that also are a little bit hidden in the product. One of them that I learned about by taking the hands-on lab that I mentioned earlier for the movie watch list application. It primarily gets its data from REST, from a website called themoviedatabase.org, but it locally has some tables that are tracking your users' preferences of which movies they'd like to watch in the future that they might have found from the movie database giant collection of films. So the local post-processing is a capability of a region that is based on a REST data source, which allows you, by referencing this # or hash Apex $source data, that represents the complicated query that Apex has already generated for you to work with the REST data. You can then wrap that effectively with any kind of legal SQL that can be joining data from a local database or pulling in information from other sources that are queryable by SQL. And in so doing, very easily blend REST data with your local queryable data in your application. So let me show you a quick example of doing that in the movie watch list application. So this is the result of taking the hands-on lab. When you add a movie, it's hitting the REST service for the movie database, which has a service that I've registered in Apex for the popular movies, and it's showing things like Turning Red from Pixar and the Batman. If you do a search, like say for Beatles, you might find other movies related to that particular search term. That is coming again over the REST data source, but locally it's joining with information and that case statement to produce a final result that's part of the application. You can drill down into a particular movie and find more details. Again, these are showing information from the REST website blended with data from the local database. So that's a cool feature to know about. And you can find it quickly in the property palette by searching for local, and you'll quickly find that local post-processing property. Another interesting capability that I've found useful in applications I built is the support that Apex has for multi-valued fields. And in the 21.2 release, that was extended to the new capability called smart filters, which is a nice compact way that your end users can search for things very similar in functionality to the faceted search, but done in a way that's kind of compact and out of the way to give more screen real estate to your cards or other data on your page. And so by defining a field for, let's say, the tags, these kind of adjectives or interesting properties that you want to apply to books in this example, you can use a multi-valued pop-up LOV to mark a book as being related to trains and also travel narrative. That multi-valued field can also then be the subject of a smart filter, searching for tags that might have one or more tags applied to it. And they work really nicely in tandem. The way that you set that up is that when you're defining your LOV or your field that's your pop-up, you mark it for multiple values and make sure to pick the same separator that you, if it's existing data, pick the separator that you're already using, or by default, it will be a colon character. But if you want to use other like a comma or whatever, just make sure that you choose the same separator when you configure your smart filter facet. It also has a multi-value property, a delimited list, and pick the same separator. And what you'll end up with is something that combines this smart filter, which I like to use in the navigation bar. I'll show how you do that in just a second. That brings up out of the way so you can have more room for your cards. And the search is just built into that nav bar. So it's right in the center and very obvious for where users will click. The way to implement that, putting the search up in the nav bar, this was another new feature in the 21.2 release, was that you can make a particular item like the smart filter here called search, make it have no parent, so it can kind of be a free agent, a floater around the page. And by marking it as no parent, it gets a number of new positions that you can choose from, one of which is called before navigation bar. And by choosing that combination, that item or that field or multiple or even a region can be put up into the navigation bar either before or after the navigation bar list menus. And by choosing this CSS class called W100P, that stands for width 100%, it will nicely stretch to fill all of the available space so that it will not leave a bunch of empty space in the navigation bar, and it will adjust automatically to the size of the screen that your user has. So let's take a quick look at the what that looks like in practice. If we look at the application for the book finder, I can go up here. The smart filter is taking up all the space in the navigation bar. I can search by rating, tags, or authors. We can see all the counts. Maybe we look for books by Brian Spendolini, and we find a couple of books about Apex. We might also search by the tags. That's another facet where you can search for books on trains and travel narrative and find the one book in my small set of books in my database that have both of those tags defined. So that combo, when you're editing a particular book, let's look at what that looks like. So we get the pop-up LOV. It will show you all the available tags, and you can pick one or proceed to pick multiple tags. And it just is a very intuitive user interface that I found my users like. So next I'll talk about the the way that you can set the cards region, it's a region that makes use of the CSS grid, or at least that's one of the options that you can pick for a grid layout for your cards. And when doing that grid layout, it uses CSS variables as a flexible way to lay out the different number of columns that will be in that grid. And the universal theme that if you pick any of the universal theme styles, it uses this variable whose names all begin with a double hyphen, --a--cv for card view, item width. So just by setting the value of that CSS variable, you can cause the number of columns in the grid to automatically change. And so I was interested in doing that in an application where I wanted to give the user the ability to either have forcibly a small size kind of thumbnail card when my images were actually much bigger, but I wanted them to cram more books into a single screen. So you can use this variable and set it to something like 180 pixels. The context that you give it, the selector, is this special pseudo class called :root that sets the variable at the highest level of your CSS element hierarchy. You could also set it on, a particular div or element by the static ID name if you want, but this sets it for the whole page. You can do that and make it a fixed amount if you want always small cards. But another interesting use of this idea is creating a pop-up list that lets, a select list that lets the end user pick between one or more sizes for their cards and have it dynamically change at runtime simply by adding a dynamic action and having that dynamic action run this one line of JavaScript that sets the value of the CSS variable to the value of the select list. And that select list in my example has these internal values, 180 pixels, 280 pixels, or 300 pixels. And we'll take a look at what that produces at runtime with the dynamic card size example here. So after setting up this pop list, the users can choose a small size, they can choose a medium size, or choose a large size. And you can see how the browser instantly resizes the whole grid of cards based on which minimum card width is currently the value of that CSS variable. So it can be quite interesting. With one additional click, you can have the select list here for the card size. If you select that you'd like it saved as a user level scope, it will remember the user's choice across logins, so that if they like seeing the medium-sized cards, the next time they log in, they'll continue to see the medium-sized cards, sort of like a user preference. So that's a very easy way to combine some declarative features with one line of JavaScript to dynamically set that card size to get some interesting results that give your users some interesting choices. Next, I'll look at something that I found in the 21.2 release as I was working on some sample applications that used a number of tabs full of these list badges that can organize and kind of give an overview of the collection of books based on the sales, based on the letter of, the letter of the alphabet that the title starts with, or based on the publisher. But what I was noticing was that when the page would initially render, just for a split second, I would see all of the contents of those three tabs, and then it would snap back to show just the current tab. But maybe because they were colorful circles that kind of called attention to themselves, it was an effect that I was trying to figure out how I could eliminate. And so I worked with some colleagues, and they helped me understand with a couple of very simple CSS rules to initially display, turn the display off of the tabs panel, and to initially turn off the display of the regions in the tab. combined with the fact that when the page is finished loading, Apex dynamically sets to be visible the current page in the group of tabs. That combo produces an effect that's more pleasing to the end user because they don't see this flashing set of colorful balls in my example with the badge charts. Another thing had to do with the cards region, where I noticed that similar to YouTube, if you see a page where the videos are loading, you get these kind of placeholder cards. Apex also has that nice feature that when the page is loading, that can give the user some useful information. But in the sample apps I was building, the data was loading so quickly that basically showing these cards seemed more kind of like the user never really got a chance to appreciate the placeholder cards. It just kind of perceived them as more of a flashing of the screen. So I learned with one more simple rule, I could initially hide those placeholder cards in situations where the data loads so quickly that it wasn't really adding a useful value to let the user know something was happening. And so the combination of combining those two sets of CSS rules into an application level CSS file gave me a look of the application that looked like this. Let's see where, book, nope. There we go. So when we load the overview page, we'll see that what the user first sees is just the first tab and the chart. They don't see all of the balls, the colorful ball charts displaying. And similarly, when we go to the cards region, the first thing they see are the cards that they need to look at. I didn't preload the images, so sorry for that. But in that case, the placeholder cards, if we try that again, we'll see that the images just load, and that's the first thing the user sees. So that could be a useful tip, which you'll find in this example app on my blog that I'll give you the link to at the end. Last couple of interesting tips I'll talk about have to do with the kind of a technique I learned from another colleague, how to create custom functionality for some of the built-in page items. In my case, I was interested in changing the behavior of certain pop-up LOVs. And I wanted to change the default behavior where it remembers what the user searched for in the search filter. I wanted it to forget the search so that every time you popped it open, you always saw the list of all the tags and not the list of the filtered tags you saw on the last time you clicked, because in that particular use case, I always wanted to start afresh and start typing the name of a new tag without the old filter in place. So I learned how to implement that functionality, and then he suggested that I would use a CSS class to be the way that other developers could simply opt into the behavior to have the reset search behavior kick in or work normally if it doesn't have this class applied to it. So you see here I've applied the pop-up LOV reset class, and that's kind of like a flag to turn on the feature that is implemented in an application level JavaScript that when the page is loaded calls this one function that handles all pop-up LOVs. If they have the class, the functionality kicks in, and if they don't have the class, it does nothing. So it behaves like normal and has a sort of sticky search filter. In that JavaScript code that's getting called, it has a jQuery selector that finds all those pop-up LOVs that have that class applied, and then it adjusts their behavior to have that special behavior. So it's more interesting is this pattern of writing some custom JavaScript and then giving it to your developers in a way that they don't have to understand how it's implemented. They simply know that if they add a class, then their pop-up LOVs will behave slightly differently in this alternative way that is sometimes useful. So in the interest of time, I'll skip showing that. And lastly, just talk about the sample approvals app. And it's one of the new samples that comes with the 22.1 release. It's something you can already play with on the apex.oracle.com website. And using the new improved gallery in 22.1, it's one of the cards you'll see in the gallery, and you can just click one button to install it. Or if you've already installed it later and you see that there's an update available, you can click the trash can to delete your current version and then install the latest version using that one-click install. So let me just quickly show you a little bit about what that sample app illustrates. So it comes with a more information page that talks about all of the capabilities of the sample, that the new human task approval feature that's part of the Apex 22.1. It tries to make much easier the types of features that you build in your application, to where somebody, a set of people, possibly dynamically determined which are the right people to approve or reject a particular decision in your application. Sometimes there may be parameters associated with making that decision. There might be custom information that the approvers need to see while they're making that decision. They might need to carry on a conversation amongst themselves while they're thinking about whether to approve or reject your request. And so this feature captures all of that into a new declarative capability that's built into the Apex product, into the platform. In the sample app, the thing that that's under discussion is whether an employee's salary or job will change. One of these is determines the approvers in a static way. The other one determines the approvers in a dynamic way. So you might propose that Alan have a salary of 2,000, and that will then become a pending approval that the appropriate person, in this case, it was assigned to a user, Jane. That assignment was done dynamically based on some things you can play with in the setup under the salary change approvers page. You can adjust some rows in a table that the sample installs that govern for which job codes a particular user will be assigned to be the approver. Since the person I picked must have been a salesman, analyst, or a manager, Jane got assigned to be the approver. And you can drill into more information about the proposal for this salary change. It's showing information about what percentage of change that relates to, and gives the reviewer a history of that employee's salary, which shows the meteoric rise of their salary over time. And that will inform the approver so that they can either approve or reject. They can type in comments like, what do you think? They can reassign reassign the task to another colleague if there are a number of available colleagues that might be on the approvals list. So this set of functionality is all just done with clicks in the Apex 22.1 release. So I wanted to leave some time for questions. So we looked at that, and so I gave you a little bit of an overview of how I got to the Apex team, which products at Oracle I've worked on over the years, and I really look forward to henceforth being part of the Apex community in these first presentations I've been involved in. Last week in Slovenia, and this event here are my first two that I've participated in. And I look forward to answering questions either on discussion forums or over email. This is my email you can send a question to. You can send me or tweet me on Twitter, or check out my blog where all of the examples I mentioned today, I've got working apps that you can download and install and check them out, along with an article that explains how they were implemented. So I appreciate your time, and now we'll open it up if there's any questions. I'll hang around if there's any interest to ask and get your question answered.
So we do have a couple of questions there, Steve.
Sure.
So the first question is, what would you recommend for mobile apps for to use a faceted search or smart filters?
Great question. One of the reasons that smart filters was created was because by its nature, the faceted search takes up quite a bit of space. In the mobile layout, it does render in a phone-friendly way, but it leads to a lot of scrolling because it sort of stacks all of the possible options. They can be collapsed, but it's just a little bit more clumsy on a mobile phone. So I would tend to go for the smart filter for a mobile app. There are other types of regions like the list region that produce or give you the ability to easily lay out things, or the cards region especially, that are very flexible and have that capability for the HTML directives to lay out your data exactly how you need in the little cards. And so the combination of list views, card views, and the smart filter can be very powerful for apps that need to be like thumb friendly on a mobile phone sized screen.
Thank you for that one. So with the regional display selectors, and you use some CSS to hide some of the other tabs, is there any JavaScript needed to do that, or is it pure CSS?
No, it's just CSS. So I was going to show an example of let's see, that's got to remember what I called that one. Book Finder. It's got to have book in the name. Through books. There we go. So I'll just show you what it looks like in the application static files. I have an app level CSS, and it has the 3 rules in it that I showed on the slides. 2 are related to the tab, the region display selector or tabs, and 1 is related to the cards. So for example, if we comment out this whole section and just leave it as a CSS with nothing in it, no rules left, they're all commented out. If I save that and we go back to the books, we'll see in the overview, those balls initially show. I don't know, hopefully the screen refreshes enough over Zoom that you could see them.
You can see that, Steve.
Okay, and then in the books, you'll see the 3 cards quickly flash. And in no time, the actual cards are showing up. So those rules live in the app level CSS, and then they're referenced in the UI CSS page. They're referenced with this line here that just refers to the static app file called app.css with this special token #min hashtag, which will just reduce the size of the CSS file to be downloaded. That's kind of done automatically by Apex as appropriate.
Yeah. Okay. And then a very similar question, and that is that the same for the LOVs that you showed as well? That's pure CSS as well.
For the multi-select LOVs, that's completely declarative. The only part you have to configure is make sure you have the separator character correctly set up to match your data. So if you like use the comma to separate your values in your field in the database, but accidentally leave the default of the colon as the separator, then things will get confused and it will just treat your A comma B comma C as one big value because there's no colons in there. So that's the only sort of declarative property you need to pay attention to. For the behavior of changing the behavior of the pop-up LOV to not remember its sticky search criteria, which it does by default, that did require some JavaScript code. And that was something I needed help from a team member. I'm not really much of a JavaScript developer. I can understand like a line or two of code and feel comfortable writing that, but I reached out to other team members that live and breathe JavaScript for their daily work, and got help from them to sort of set up both learn the interesting pattern of how to set up the JavaScript, and they helped me with the right code for clearing out that search criteria that I wanted to forget about on every time the pop-up was popped open.
Yeah. We've got another question just around regional display selectors. Is there any plans to make the change that you showed be declarative? So, because instead of you putting that CSS in, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I know there's a new template option in 22.1 that I believe for certain use cases can be used to gain what you might think of as a previous page loading behavior, because what apparently there was some optimizations made for how pages loaded and how things are done, which had the side effect of causing some changes to when the user sees those elements. And so the CSS that I researched and looked into was one way of hiding that. This template option that's part of the 22.1 new features is another alternative for that. I believe it would accomplish the same thing by just picking one of that new template option. Its name is escaping me at the moment, but I believe it's mentioned in the new features document.
Cool. We've got a lot of thank yous. Thank you for your chat. Great talk. Then we've got another question from Paul Jones. When can we expect Apex release that is purely around fixes and improvements to existing functionality rather than new features that the majority of users don't necessarily require or can already be achieved more manually?
Well, we do release about every month a patch set that does have only bug fixes in it. Each major release is going to necessarily have both improved existing features, some bug fixes, as well as a few major features that sometimes take more than a year to implement. So we sometimes can't predict how long those will take, and some releases may have more or less depending on which things fit into a particular release train. I can't say that it's currently our plan to consciously make a release that only has bug fixes, but the idea exchange or the ideas app under apex.oracle.com/ideas is one way to help us know which features you are interested in. Voting on the ones that you're most interested in can make sure we're focusing our resources on the right set of features. But as I mentioned in my talk, we have some internal teams that also are, in some cases, building things on their own. In other cases, might be giving us cool ideas that might be a feature you never thought of that you think once you see it is something that you could make nice use of in your own applications. So some of the use cases, more complicated use cases that an internal team might have, sometimes do end up in a nice declarative feature that could solve a number of different problems with just tweaking different options. And so we're hoping that those are the kind of features that do come out and you do find in other versions that'll be coming out in the future.
Cool. We've got a question from Zenat. He just says smart filter. If you could elaborate on that a bit more, Zenat, and we'll answer that in a moment. A question from FJ. Would that loading technique work for list view report, which seems to render first rows as basic HTML before showing the final expected layout? what should I consider for it to work with LVs?
List view.
Yeah.
I have used the list view in some of my applications, but I haven't experienced that behavior that they're talking about. So I don't have any direct suggestion. If they want to email me with a little more details, I can touch base with a colleague who may know an answer. I can get back to them.
Cool, that's good. Thank you. Question from Richard Sylvester. Haven't tried HTML expression directives in any of my apps. Are there any example blog posts for sample?
Yeah, I know that there's a post by my colleague John Snyders. He had a post that I read recently that was talking about how to make use of the various case and if, else, and loop. There's a loop, 3 main kinds of directives that you can use. Initially, they worked only in client side, primarily employed in the cards region, but there may be other client side cases that it also works. The interesting thing with 22.1 is for the first time it works on the server, not in every possible place where you might want it to work, and we are working on that for future releases, but the first interesting kind of self-contained place where we could get it working on the server was the email templates. So that's what you can do with the email templates is kind of a flavor of what you'll eventually be able to do in other places where you type in an HTML on the server side rendering. You'll eventually also be able to use these templates to get a more readable, easy to understand way of doing conditional formatting, and that will alleviate some of the times you need to put the conditional part of your formatting into your select statement, because the alternative is that you often might have your select statement do a case, and then depending on different values in your SQL, generate different chunks of HTML that you then include in the page without the escaping on. But it would just be nicer if your query could focus on querying the data and your UI could conditionally decide how that data should be formatted. Today, you have kind of a mix of those techniques, but in the future, we'll be able to apply that in more places on server than just the email templates.
Yep. Thank you. Another question. Compared to other development tool sets that you've used, what is the main thing that needs to be added or improved in Apex?
Well, some of the things we talk with analysts, that's one of the things that, when we're compared against other low-code platforms, things that we've been working on, and the first elements are visible in 22.1, are things like a workflow type of capability. We have the open source Flows for Apex available today from flowsforapex.org. That's a tool that, if you're familiar with the BPMN, is a visual workflow that's quite powerful and has a PL/SQL engine that works really nicely with Apex. So that's something you don't have to wait for to get that power. The flip side is it takes a little bit of learning to understand what all the BPMN tasks and features mean and which ones would be interesting for your use cases. So you can take training on that, or the doc it can train you on that. Workflow is one big area that we're expanding in the future to try to build some more simpler declarative features to accomplish what today you might have to always write PL/SQL to do. Do that in the product. Another big area customers are always asking about is, well, what's the best way to do source control and make our builds? And you might have heard that called the continuous integration pipeline. There's different terminology for that. That's an area we're researching and investing in, adding some more built-in features into the product. But in 22.1, we already have a nice addition, which is that one of the big complaints is that it's hard to compare the export files from Apex, which are these SQL files that are basically filled with PL/SQL procedure calls, you'll see a lot of repetition of parameter names, and they're not so friendly because, you know, it's sort of like more parameters than properties in those files. And so the new 22.1 release has a nice YAML export format where you literally can just see only what changed, because all the other information that isn't related to your metadata is gone. So it's just a nice way of, you know, bringing up your visual code tool, looking at your Git repository and diffing all your pages or processes or whatever you've created, and you just get a nice clean view of what has changed, and that can help with code review. So that's a first chapter that we're delivering in the story of a more integrated, useful capability for this managing your source control. But what is interesting is that we realize many applications won't be only built 100% with Apex. They might integrate some web services, maybe built with ORDs or maybe built with Java. So companies probably have a pipeline and a tool chain or a set of functionality that they use for their combination of technologies for their application building. And so we want to do our best to make sure Apex always works well into an existing pipeline. And in the future, we hope to propose a more kind of a built-in way that if someone is building a 100% Apex app, we'll have more of a kind of a recommended or what sometimes you might think of as an opinionated way of doing it. If you don't already have a way you like to do it, that's one of those ways is not built into the product at the moment. So we have command line with SQL or the now deprecated Apex export Java command line tool. SQL going forward will be the way that you'll script these interactions, exporting and importing Apex applications or individual Apex components. And in the future, we're going to build on that to have some more built-in functionality for doing that kind of team development in an easier way with, you know, clicks and your mouse from the browser.
Okay, so we don't have any more questions, Steve.
Okay.
Thank you very much for presenting today.
Okay,
I learned some stuff myself, so worthwhile.
Great.
And thank you to everybody else for attending. Tomorrow through the Meetup site, I'll send out a survey. So if you could please fill in the survey, that would be greatly appreciated.
Okay. So, appreciate your time. Thanks for coming.
Yeah. Thank you for your time, everybody.
Okay. Have a good evening.
Right.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.